At 11:47 a.m. on June 26, 1943, Second Lieutenant Robert Samuel Johnson watched his instrument panel explode. The 20-millimeter cannon shell had punched through the nose of his P-47 Thunderbolt somewhere between the engine and the cockpit. Shrapnel ripped through hydraulic lines. Fluid sprayed across the inside of his canopy. His oxygen system disintegrated, and then the fire started. Johnson was 23 years old, flying his 8th combat mission over occupied France, with exactly one confirmed kill to his name. The Focke-Wulf 190 that had just crippled his aircraft was already swinging around for another pass. Behind it, Johnson could see at least 4 more German fighters circling like sharks that had smelled blood in the water. His engine was hit. His controls were sluggish. His canopy was jammed shut, trapping him in a cockpit filling with smoke and the acrid smell of burning hydraulic fluid. The English Channel was 90 miles away. He was alone, damaged, and the entire Luftwaffe seemed to be lining up to finish him off. The Germans had every reason to believe this American was done. What happened over the next 17 minutes would become one of the most extraordinary survival stories in the history of aerial combat, and it would prove something about the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt that no engineer had ever designed into its blueprints. Some aircraft can take a beating and keep flying. The P-47 could take a beating that should have killed any airplane ever built, absorb punishment that defied the laws of physics and metallurgy, and still bring its pilot home. But on this day, over the fields of France, Robert Johnson would ask his Thunderbolt to do something more than survive. He would ask it to fight back. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never supposed to exist. In 1940, the United States Army Air Corps wanted a lightweight interceptor, something nimble, fast, cheap to produce. What they got instead was a 7-ton monster that their own pilots called the Jug, short for Juggernaut. It was the largest single-engine fighter ever built by any nation during World War II. Fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and a pilot, it weighed over 17,000 pounds. A Spitfire weighed less than half that. The man responsible for this magnificent beast was Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant who had fled the Russian Revolution and found his way to the drawing boards of Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York. Kartveli understood something that other designers missed. In modern air combat, speed and firepower mattered more than agility, and the only way to get enough speed and firepower was to build big. The heart of the P-47 was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial powerhouse that produced 2,000 horsepower. To put that in perspective, the engine alone weighed nearly 2,400 pounds. It was fed by a turbocharger system that ran the entire length of the fuselage, from just behind the engine to the tail section and back again. The ducting added weight. The intercoolers added weight. Everything about the P-47 added weight. But that weight came with advantages that wouldn't become apparent until pilots started flying it in combat. The R2800 was air-cooled. Unlike the liquid-cooled engines in the P-51 Mustang or the British Spitfire, the Thunderbolt had no radiator, no coolant lines, no vulnerable plumbing that a single rifle-caliber bullet could rupture and drain. You could shoot holes in a P-47's engine cowling all day long, and as long as you didn't hit something critical, that massive radial would keep turning. The cockpit sat behind and above the engine, protected by that 2,400-pound wall of steel and aluminum. Pilots joked that if they got in trouble, they could unbuckle their harness and run around inside the spacious cockpit until they found somewhere to hide. The joke wasn't far from the truth. The P-47's cockpit was enormous by fighter standards, roomy enough that pilots described the seat as being like a lounge chair. Behind the pilot's seat sat an armor plate. Below the seat, self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb bullet hits without igniting. The whole aircraft was built like a flying tank, with structural redundancy that allowed it to sustain damage that would tear apart lighter fighters. And then there were the guns. 8.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing. Each gun fired at a rate of 850 rounds per minute. Combined, the P-47 could put out over 100 rounds per second. A wall of lead that could saw through a German fighter like a chainsaw through balsa wood. The ammunition load was 425 rounds per gun, giving pilots enough firepower for extended engagements without running dry after the first pass. The Luftwaffe quickly learned to respect the Thunderbolt's armament. One German ace, Heinz Baer, who scored 220 aerial victories during the war, later said that the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. Coming from a man who had shot down more aircraft than almost anyone in history, that was high praise. But the P-47 had weaknesses that German pilots exploited ruthlessly in the spring of 1943. It couldn't climb worth a damn. At low and medium altitudes where most dogfights occurred, the Thunderbolt clawed for altitude like a drunk man climbing stairs. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s could zoom away from it in a vertical climb, then roll over and come screaming back down with an energy advantage that no amount of American firepower could overcome. It couldn't turn. The P-47's massive weight meant it needed a football field to reverse direction. German fighters could complete a full 360-degree turn while a Thunderbolt was still trying to come around. We would see it coming from behind, one Luftwaffe pilot recalled, and pull up fast. The P-47 couldn't follow, and we came around and got on its tail. And in early 1943, it couldn't go far enough. The P-47's internal fuel capacity gave it barely enough range to escort bombers to the French coast before turning back. American heavy bombers, B-17 and B-24s, were flying deep into occupied Europe without fighter protection, and the Germans were slaughtering them by the dozen. The men who flew the P-47 in those early days learned its limitations the hard way. The 56th Fighter Group, nicknamed Zemke's Wolf Pack after their commander Colonel Hubert Zemke, arrived in England in early 1943 as the first American unit to take the Thunderbolt into combat. They had trained in the aircraft. They knew its specifications by heart, but nothing had prepared them for what they were about to face. Robert Johnson was one of those Wolfpack pilots. Johnson grew up in Lawton, Oklahoma, a dusty army town near Fort Sill, where cavalry horses still outnumbered automobiles. He fell in love with aviation at age 8 when his father took him to an air show, and he watched 3 pursuit biplanes perform aerobatics that seemed to defy gravity. From that moment, all he wanted to do was fly. He spent his teenage years hunting rabbits and squirrels with a .22 rifle, developing the marksmanship instincts that would later save his life. He learned to lead a moving target, to calculate bullet drop, to squeeze rather than jerk the trigger. Years later, he would credit those Oklahoma hunting trips with teaching him how to shoot down German fighters. Johnson joined the Army Air Corps in 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor. He washed out of flight training on his first attempt. The instructors said he was too aggressive, too impatient, too unwilling to follow procedures. He talked his way into a second chance and graduated near the top of his class. The same aggression that had almost ended his career would soon make him one of the deadliest fighter pilots in the European theater. He arrived in England with the 56th Fighter Group in January 1943. The P-47s came a few weeks later, and Johnson fell in love all over again. He loved the power of the R2-800 engine, the way the aircraft seemed to leap forward when he pushed the throttle. He loved the feeling of sitting behind that massive radial, protected by tons of metal. He loved the sound of 8.50 calibers firing simultaneously, a thunderous roar that shook the entire airframe. But combat quickly revealed the gap between training and reality. The 56th flew its first combat mission on April 13, 1943, a fighter sweep over occupied Europe. Nothing happened. The Germans didn't come up to fight. The second mission was the same, and the third. After 31 combat missions, the Wolfpack had yet to claim a single enemy aircraft. Meanwhile, they were losing planes to mechanical failures, pilot errors, and occasional German fighters that caught them by surprise. The first confirmed kill for a P-47 came on April 15th, when Major Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group caught a Focke-Wulf 190 in a dive and shot it down over Ostend. The celebration was muted by the fact that 3 P-47s had been lost that same day, 1 shot down, 2 to engine failures. Johnson got his first kill on June 13, 1943, during a sweep over Rouen. He spotted an FW-190 below him, dove on it with his throttle wide open, and blasted it to pieces with a 3-second burst. The German never saw him coming. It was a clean, professional kill, exactly the kind of hit-and-run attack that P-47 tactics emphasized. 13 days later, everything fell apart. June 26, 1943. The mission was a bomber escort to Villacoublay airfield near Paris. Over 200 B-17 flying fortresses were hitting German aircraft factories, and the Luftwaffe was rising in force to stop them. Johnson was flying with the 61st Fighter Squadron, part of a massive fighter escort that included P-47s from multiple groups. The trouble started when Johnson's flight got separated from the main formation. Standard procedure said to climb back to altitude and rejoin, but Johnson spotted a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s below him, preparing to attack the bombers. He broke formation to warn the rest of his group. His radio wasn't working. Johnson pressed the transmit button again and again, shouting warnings that went nowhere. The German fighters were climbing toward the bomber stream, and no one could hear him. In desperation, he decided to attack alone, hoping to disrupt the enemy formation before they could reach the B-17s. It was a brave decision. It was also, by his own later admission, a stupid one. Johnson dove on the German formation from above, building speed as he dropped through 20,000 feet. He picked out a Focke-Wulf at the back of the formation, got it in his gun sight, and pressed the trigger. His .50 caliber rifles roared. Tracer rounds reached out toward the enemy fighter. He missed. The German pilot snapped into a violent turn. Johnson tried to follow, but his P-47 was too heavy, too slow to respond. By the time he came around, the FW-190 had reversed on him, and now Johnson was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. The first burst of 20mm cannon fire hit the nose of Johnson's P-47 and blew apart his instrument panel. Shrapnel sprayed through the cockpit. Hydraulic fluid erupted from severed lines, coating the inside of his canopy with reddish-brown liquid. The oxygen system that kept him conscious at altitude disintegrated. Johnson grabbed the canopy release to bail out. It was jammed. The frame had been warped by the cannon hit, sealing him inside. More hits came. Johnson felt the P-47 shudder as shells tore through the fuselage. The engine was running rough now, coughing and sputtering. Smoke filled the cockpit. Not the black smoke of a fuel fire, but the gray smoke of burning insulation and hydraulic fluid. His controls felt loose, disconnected, as if the cables linking his stick to the ailerons had been severed. And the Germans kept coming. Johnson could see them through the smoke and the hydraulic fluid streaking across his canopy. At least 4, maybe 5 Focke-Wulf 190s circling his crippled aircraft like wolves around a wounded elk. They knew he was finished. They were taking their time, lining up perfect shots, enjoying the kill. The lead German fighter slid into position behind Johnson's right wing. Johnson watched him through his peripheral vision. A beautiful aircraft, painted blue with a brilliant yellow nose. The German pilot was flying just off Johnson's wingtip, examining the damage, probably wondering why the American hadn't bailed out yet. Then the German eased back and dropped behind Johnson's tail. Johnson knew what was coming. He grabbed the seat adjustment lever and dropped his seat as low as it would go, hunching down behind the armor plate that protected his back. If he was going to die, he would make the Germans work for it. The Focke-Wulf opened fire. Bullets slammed into the P-47 like hail on a tin roof. Johnson could hear them hitting, a metallic rattling that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The German was using his 7.92mm machine guns, pouring round after round into the crippled Thunderbolt, probing for the fuel tanks, the engine, the pilot. Johnson sat hunched in his seat, armor plate against his back, and waited to die. The firing stopped. Johnson looked up. The German fighter had pulled alongside again, and the pilot was staring at him through his canopy. Even at a distance of 20 feet, Johnson could see the confusion on the man's face. The American should be dead. The American should be falling in flames. Instead, the P-47 was still flying, engine still running, pilot still very much alive. The German shook his head in what looked like disbelief. Then he peeled away and came around for another pass. Johnson had one chance. His controls were damaged, but not completely gone. His engine was running rough, but it was running, and his guns, 8.50 caliber machine guns with over 3,000 rounds of ammunition, had not been hit. The German thought he was shooting at a corpse. He was about to find out how wrong he was. Johnson kicked his rudder hard left and slowed his aircraft to a crawl. The maneuver was suicidal under normal circumstances. Bleeding speed in a dogfight was a death sentence, but Johnson wasn't fighting a normal dogfight. He was fighting for survival in an aircraft that shouldn't still be flying, against an enemy who had already written him off. The German came around for his killing pass, lining up behind Johnson's tail with the confidence of a hunter who knows his prey can't escape. He opened fire, his machine guns chattering, tracers streaming past Johnson's canopy. But Johnson wasn't where the German expected him to be. The sudden deceleration had thrown off the German's aim. His rounds passed harmlessly behind the P-47's tail, and in that moment, as the Focke-Wulf overshot and slid out in front of Johnson's nose, the American had a clear shot. Johnson squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. His guns were jammed, or the electrical system had failed, or the cannon hits had severed the firing circuits. Johnson didn't know which, and it didn't matter. He was defenseless. The German pilot realized what had happened almost immediately. He pulled his FW-190 into a climbing turn, coming around for another pass. This time, there would be no mistakes. This time, the American would die. Johnson did the only thing he could do. He dove. The P-47 was many things, but above all else it was heavy, and heavy meant fast in a dive. Johnson shoved his stick forward and pointed his nose at the French countryside 20,000 feet below. The Thunderbolt accelerated like a dropped anvil, the airspeed indicator climbing past 400 miles per hour, then 450, then beyond the limits of what the needle could measure. The Germans tried to follow. They couldn't. The Focke-Wulf 190 was faster than the P-47 in level flight, more maneuverable in a turn, superior in almost every way that mattered in a dogfight. But in a dive, nothing could catch the Thunderbolt. The massive weight that made it clumsy in a turning fight made it unstoppable going downhill. Johnson pulled out at treetop level, his damaged engine screaming in protest, his controls barely responding. The French countryside blurred past beneath him. Fields, farmhouses, roads, all flashing by at nearly 500 miles per hour. He didn't know if the Germans were still behind him. He didn't look back. He just flew. The English Channel was 90 miles away. 90 miles of occupied France. 90 miles of German flak batteries, 90 miles of enemy territory that he had to cross in an aircraft that was falling apart around him. Johnson pointed his nose northwest and started flying. The P-47 was dying. Johnson could feel it in the controls, in the way the engine coughed and sputtered, in the vibration that shook the entire airframe. Oil was streaming back from the cowling, coating his already obscured canopy with a black film that made it nearly impossible to see. The hydraulic fluid that had sprayed across the cockpit was now mixing with smoke from somewhere behind the instrument panel. But the engine kept running. Johnson later learned that the R-2800 had taken multiple hits during the engagement. Cylinders had been damaged. Oil lines had been severed. The turbocharger ducting had been punctured in a dozen places. By every measure of aircraft engineering, the engine should have seized and stopped. It didn't. The big Pratt & Whitney radial kept turning, kept producing power, kept dragging Johnson's shattered Thunderbolt toward home. The air-cooled design that engineers had chosen for reliability was proving its worth in the most extreme test imaginable. Johnson flew at treetop level for the first 20 miles, using the terrain to hide from German fighters and flak batteries. His airspeed had dropped to around 250 miles per hour. The engine couldn't produce enough power for anything faster. The controls were getting worse. The stick felt like it was connected to the ailerons by rubber bands instead of steel cables. At some point, Johnson realized he could see blue water on the horizon, the English Channel, safety, home. He also realized he wasn't alone. A single Focke-Wulf 190 had followed him. The same blue aircraft with the yellow nose that had examined his damage earlier, flown by the same pilot who had emptied his guns into Johnson's P-47 and watched in disbelief as the American refused to die. The German was flying formation with Johnson now, sitting off his right wing, matching his speed. He wasn't attacking, he was watching, waiting to see if the American would make it. Johnson looked over at his enemy. The German looked back. For a long moment, the two pilots flew side by side. One in a pristine fighter with full ammunition, the other in a flying wreck held together by nothing but stubbornness and American engineering. Then the German pilot raised his hand and saluted. Johnson didn't understand. Was it a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement that the American had earned his survival, a farewell from one warrior to another? The German peeled away and disappeared back toward France. Johnson never saw him again. He never learned who the pilot was, never discovered if the man survived the war. But he never forgot that salute, the moment when an enemy chose honor over the kill. Johnson crossed the English Channel at wavetop height, his engine running on fumes and prayers. The white cliffs of Dover appeared through the oil-smeared canopy, the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. He nursed the P-47 across the coast and started looking for somewhere to land. The nearest airfield was Manston, an RAF emergency field designed for exactly this situation, damaged aircraft that couldn't make it back to their home bases. Johnson lined up on the runway, lowered his landing gear using the emergency backup system, and set the P-47 down. The aircraft rolled to a stop. Johnson sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands shaking, unable to move. Then he reached for the canopy release. It still wouldn't open. Ground crews had to use crowbars to pry Johnson out of his aircraft. When they finally got the canopy off, they found a pilot who looked like he'd been through a war, face covered in hydraulic fluid and soot, eyebrows singed from the cockpit fire, hands trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. Then they looked at the airplane. The ground crews at Manston had seen damaged aircraft before. They had repaired Spitfires and Hurricanes and Typhoons that had limped back from combat with holes in their wings and bullets in their engines. They thought they knew what battle damage looked like. They had never seen anything like Robert Johnson's P-47. The aircraft had over 200 bullet holes, 21 hits from 20mm cannon shells. The engine cowling looked like Swiss cheese. The fuselage was torn open in multiple places, with control cables visible through the gaps. The canopy frame had been warped by a direct hit. The rudder was shredded. The elevators were hanging by threads. One mechanic counted the holes and stopped when he reached 200. There were too many to count accurately. He estimated the total was closer to 300. The crew chief looked at the aircraft, looked at Johnson, and said something that Johnson would remember for the rest of his life. "Sir, this airplane will never fly again. I don't understand how it flew today." Johnson didn't understand either. By every principle of aeronautical engineering, his P-47 should have fallen out of the sky somewhere over France. The damage was catastrophic. The control surfaces were destroyed. The engine was running on cylinders that had been punctured by cannon fire. But the Thunderbolt had kept flying. The massive radial engine had kept turning. The redundant control systems had kept responding, barely, just enough to maintain flight. The armor plate had kept the pilot alive. The self-sealing fuel tanks had refused to ignite despite dozens of hits. The P-47 had been designed to be tough. On June 26, 1943, it proved just how tough it could be. Johnson was back in the cockpit 3 days later, flying a new P-47 on another escort mission over France. The Germans were still there, the war was still being fought, and Robert Johnson had learned something about himself and his aircraft that would make him one of the deadliest fighter pilots in the European theater. He had learned that he could survive anything. Over the next 11 months, Johnson shot down 26 more German aircraft. His final tally of 27 confirmed victories tied him with Francis Gabreski as the highest-scoring American ace in the European theater. Both men flew P-47 Thunderbolts. Both men were products of Zemke's Wolf Pack. Both men understood that the key to survival in aerial combat wasn't flying the most maneuverable aircraft or the fastest aircraft. It was flying the aircraft that could take punishment and keep fighting. Johnson flew 91 combat missions before being rotated back to the United States in May 1944. The Army Air Forces wanted him alive. Experienced pilots were worth more as instructors than as statistics. He spent the rest of the war teaching new fighter pilots the lessons he had learned over France and Germany. The P-47 Thunderbolt went on to become the most produced American fighter of World War II. Over 15,600 were built between 1942 and 1945. They flew more than 500,000 combat sorties. They shot down 3,752 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, more than any other Allied fighter. They destroyed thousands of locomotives, tens of thousands of vehicles, countless German positions on the ground. The Thunderbolt's kill ratio was 4.6 to 1. For every P-47 lost in combat, nearly 5 enemy aircraft went down, and the loss rate was remarkably low, just 0.7% per mission. Pilots who flew the Jug came home. The 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, ended the war as the highest-scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force, with 674.5 confirmed aerial victories. They were the only group in the 8th to refuse the P-51 Mustang when it became available, choosing instead to keep flying their beloved Thunderbolts until the end of the war. When asked why they stuck with the P-47, the Wolfpack pilots gave the same answer. The Mustang was faster, the Mustang had longer range, the Mustang was more maneuverable. But the Thunderbolt brought you home. Robert Johnson returned to civilian life after the war, but he never stopped flying. He became a test pilot for Republic Aviation, the company that had built the P-47, and later worked for various aerospace companies. He wrote a memoir, Thunderbolt, that became one of the classic accounts of aerial combat in World War II. He died on December 27, 1998, at the age of 78. His obituaries mention the 27 kills, the Distinguished Service Cross, the record as one of America's greatest fighter aces. But the pilots who had flown with him remembered something else. They remembered June 26, 1943. They remembered a young lieutenant who should have died over France, whose aircraft should have fallen in flames, who should have been just another statistic in the bloody calculus of aerial warfare. They remembered a P-47 Thunderbolt that refused to quit. And they remembered that salute, one warrior acknowledging another across the gulf of war and nationality in a moment of respect that transcended the violence swirling around them. The Germans thought Robert Johnson was done. His aircraft was crippled, his controls were damaged, his canopy was jammed shut. By every measure that mattered, he should have been an easy kill. But the P-47 Thunderbolt was not like other aircraft, and Robert Johnson was not like other pilots. Together, they proved that sometimes the machine that seems too heavy, too clumsy, too unsophisticated can outperform everything else in the sky, not through speed or agility, but through sheer, stubborn, magnificent durability. The Jug brought its pilot home, and in the end, that's the only thing that mattered. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about pilots who refuse to quit, about aircraft that refuse to die. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Robert Johnson and his incredible P-47 Thunderbolt are not forgotten. These men and machines deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.